We'll next talk about chloride, but just briefly. Basically, just about all our dietary chloride comes from table salt, NaCl, sodium chloride. Our chloride needs are about 2,300 milligrams per day, and keeping in mind the amount of sodium we typically consume, and remember that they are paired, so we typically do not have a problem meeting our chloride needs. Chloride functions to maintain fluid balance along with sodium. It also is involved in the component of stomach acid, hydrochloric acid, HCl. So deficiency is rare. It can occur with frequent vomiting coupled with a poor diet. Symptoms will include weakness, anorexia, and lethargy. The upper level is set at 3,600 milligrams per day, and that's actually been determined based on the upper level of sodium. So there's really less a concern about consuming too much chloride, and it's just more because because along with it you're tending to consume sodium. And you get to that point, it can contribute to high blood pressure, but again, that seems to be more about the sodium intake. Next, we'll talk about calcium. Now, typically we find calcium in dairy products and foods made with dairy products, as well as leafy greens, which are a good source, although we'll talk about some exceptions. Almonds are a good source of calcium, as are calcium-fortified fruit juices, soy and rice milk, breakfast cereals, and canned fish. You want to consider the amount per serving as well as the bioavailability. In leafy greens, most calcium is bound to oxalic acid, so although those greens can be a good source of calcium, the amount that is going to be available to the body is much less than what you get from the same amount of calcium in these other foods, such as dairy products. I'll mention that spinach in particular is a very poor source of calcium because it's so high in oxalates. Here we've got that diagram from your book, as we have been seeing for most of the micronutrients, and it just gives some examples of different foods and how much of the nutrient they provide. So you can see here some food sources of calcium. Now, do you know which vitamin improves calcium absorption? We've talked about it before. It's vitamin D. And there are other diet factors that influence calcium absorption as well. I actually addressed them previously, so I won't repeat that. But just keep in mind again that you want to look for the more bioavailable sources of calcium if you're having trouble meeting your calcium needs. Calcium is stored, again, as a reminder, in bones as well as in teeth. Calcium does have quite a few functions. Of course, we usually think about bones and teeth, but it's also involved in blood clotting, transmission of nerve impulses, muscle contraction, as well as cell metabolism. Pardon me. Both calcium and phosphorus are major components of bones. And bone remodeling is ongoing throughout adulthood. In middle age, I see that's a typo, it should say lose. We lose more bone than we make, and women in particular are at high risk of increased bone loss. We'll come back to that in actually a moment, but we'll talk first about blood clotting. The other functions of calcium, that includes blood clotting, transmission of nerve impulses to target cells. They're transmitted across a synapse at the end of the nerve, and that causes calcium to flow into the nerve. In terms of muscle contractions, calcium is released from the intracellular muscle stores when stimulated by a nerve impulse, and that then permits the contractile proteins to slide along each other, and that leads to muscle contraction. Now, here we see what a muscle spasm, the image is supposed to indicate a muscle spasm, which is known as tetany, and that occurs when blood calcium levels are low. Especially you see that in the hands and feet. All right, so let's talk more about osteoporosis. It's diagnosed when bone loss and bone strength decline. Bones are fragile and they're likely to break. Most likely to break are the hip, wrist, or vertebrae. Compression fractures in vertebrae can lead to something called kyphosis. And that's where the spine curves, and often the back begins to hunch because the spine is curved so severely. So let's look at a comparison of two different women. So one of whom achieved a higher peak bone mineral density, and this usually occurs somewhere around the age of 30. So that because of that higher peak, although she did experience losses as she got older, which is what all humans will go through as they age, you can see that in her elder years, she's just kind of traveling into this lower bone mineral density level. Whereas this second person, they start out at the same place, but you can see that her peak was not nearly as high. So when she began to lose bone mineral density, this occurred, first of all, more rapidly and also much more severely, so that she has reached osteoporosis, around the age of 70. And you can see here that significant curvature of the spine and how her back is beginning to hunch. And so again, this is in part because of inadequate calcium intake. And this is just another example of, the spine curving and you're starting to see that hunchback effect. So just another view of that. So how do we prevent osteoporosis? Well, again, diets that are adequate in calcium and vitamin D in particular, as well as magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, vitamin K, and protein, all can help to minimize the risk for osteoporosis. Engaging in weight-bearing physical activity. So that means activity where you're moving your own body weight can be really beneficial in terms of preventing or at least lowering your risk for osteoporosis. Avoiding smoking. And the recommendations also say eat less meat, desserts, fried food, consume less alcohol, and sweetened beverages. So, that's a lot. I think if you focus on these first three and just, kind of keep an eye on these last foods, that tends to provide really beneficial results. There are other benefits of calcium. There is research that indicates that it can help protect against colon cancer, the formation of kidney stones, because those are calcium oxalate, and also can protect against high blood pressure, which is, you may remember, why the DASH diet is higher in low-fat dairy products, provides calcium. Going back to kidney stones, which we just talked about, this shows the formation of one of these stones, and you can imagine why it's painful to pass these. In terms of an upper level for calcium, the recommendation is 2,500 milligrams per day for adults 19 to 50 years old, and then 2,000 milligrams per day for those over 50 years old. If you exceed that upper level, it can increase the risk of kidney stones or the risk of hypercalcemia, so high levels of calcium in the blood. It can also cause irritability, headache, kidney failure, or decreased absorption of other minerals. And you're not going to need to remember the upper levels for calcium. You may want to recall the RDA for calcium, which is 1,000 milligrams, or the daily value, which is 1,300 milligrams. And I realized that it wasn't on the slide in text, but it was on the image of the food sources. So you might want to remember those numbers, but you do not need to remember these. All right, we'll go on and talk about phosphorus. Phosphorus is found, again, in dairy products like milk and cheese. It's also found in meat, bakery products, and cereals. The RDA, which you don't need to remember, and the daily value, which you don't need to remember, are listed here in case you're interested. But you can see most Americans get more than the RDA recommends. So deficiency is not a typical concern. Here again are, is one of our diagrams to just show some foods that provide phosphorus. Functions. Remember, again, it's a component of bone and teeth. It's also critical to the function of every cell. You may remember we talked about the phospholipid bilayer in cell membranes. It's also part of ATP and also DNA and RNA. And it's involved in the regulation of acid-base balance. So phosphorus actually does a lot in our bodies. Next, we'll move on and talk about magnesium. This is found in a lot of different sources. It's in chlorophyll. So the richest sources are plant products. That includes green leafy veggies, broccoli, squash, beans, nuts, seeds, as well as whole grains and chocolate. And we also get it in tap water. You don't need to know the needs for this one, so just something to look at if you're interested. Here again, we've got our diagram just to help you get a sense of some sources. In terms of functions of magnesium, it is the second most abundant intracellular cation. It helps stabilize ATP. It's part of the enzyme that pumps sodium out of the cells and potassium in. It's needed for synthesis of both DNA and RNA, nerve transmission, heart and smooth muscle contraction, as well as glucose and insulin metabolism. And it contributes to bone structure and mineralization as well. And we've kind of mentioned that along the way. Deficiency will lead to irregular heartbeat, overall weakness, muscle spasms. Person can become disoriented, experience nausea and vomiting, potentially seizures, and also a decrease in parathyroid hormone. Above the upper level, diarrhea can result, but as you can see, deficiency is a larger concern. And that is the end of this chapter. Thank you all. We'll talk next about chapter 15, which covers trace minerals.